Do what thou will be the whole piece of law.
Welcome back. Today, I wanted to talk about something that is pervasive, in my life at least. Something that shows up a lot, and I have a feeling that you may feel it as well. The squeeze of our modern times. How it feels you're working for almost nothing. But what if I told you that this was only as much an unspoken rule as it was a physical rule, a legal rule, a precedent established back in 1919? One you've probably heard of, but I feel you don't understand. It's very nuanced. It has a lot of interpretations, and I feel it's usually held up as meaning one particular thing, when in fact, I feel people focus on that one thing too specifically. But what am I talking about? Well, before we can get to what I'm talking about, I need to set the stage, and I feel you'll figure it out as I begin to go along, probably from the title, but just humor me. Allow me to set the stage. I'm going to bring you back to 1863, where a man named Henry Ford is born. Now, you may know him for his career successes later in life, founding one of the most successful car companies in the United States, and being a grand industrial pioneer, being one of the robber barons or business magnates, depending on how kind or critique-filled you would like to be. He was undisputedly, though, a man of genius when it came to industrials. He had a can-do attitude and a mechanical knack, which no one else had. And it was his company, founded in 1903, bearing the name Ford Motor Company, had an initial investment, as all businesses do, of about $28,000. Now, this is where I would say, using the inflation calculator provided by the United States, he received an initial investment of about $28,000. Now, the CPI data does not go back that far, so I'm using 1913, but it's approximately like $1 million in today's money. Small loan of $1 million. So Henry Ford starts off with a small loan of $1 million. Now, how does he bring this together? He's got a gang with him, and of course, this gang of people is made up of a few high society members. 2 lawyers, a secretary, John S. Gray, Alexander Malcolmson, and 2 people named John Francis Dodge and Horace Elgin Dodge. Now, these people are going to become more relevant later in the story, but just know that they hold a substantial stake in Ford Motor Company, as when it goes public, the initial agreement of the Dodge brothers and a lot of the other involved parties was to get a small percentage of stock in Ford Motor Company. The Dodge brothers, as I will continue to call them, received about 10% of Ford Motor Company's stock. Now, what made Ford Motor Company so successful? Well, using auto parts sourced from the Dodge brothers, primarily. He also had some other sources, but there was a tactical reason why he paired up with the Dodge brothers, and that was because they supplied him with a bunch of auto parts. Now, what were these auto parts used to make? Cars. Remember Henry Ford's Model T? The car that basically founded the car? The car that founded the car. It was a pristine invention, one that had nigh been seen before, because fun facts about the Model T include Henry Ford has a lot of myth around him, so I don't really want to give him too much myth, but I just love playing into myths of historical figures. So he has this story about, I had a pocket watch when I was a kid and I could disassemble it and reassemble it better than it was without any technical knowledge or skill, basically just to show that he was super technologically savvy. And he was, I don't want to say scheming's too dark a word, he was thinking and planning about how to make a decent car. And all the things that we take for granted in cars today are attributed to Henry Ford, namely that in the United States at least, all the correct countries, I will note, who drive on the right side of the road. Looking at you, England, you're boned anyway. Might as well just switch over to the left side and see if you can salvage whatever you can. Anyway, wheels being on the left side in America, not having steam boilers as your engine, instead inventing, the transmission, that thing that allows you to change gears and go faster or slower, and depending on your car, maybe manual or automatic. Don't even look at the automatic transmission. It's nightmare fuel, regardless of how you look at it. It's horrible. vehicle, but he invented basically everything that is foundational to the car, and he created the car that founded the car, the Model T, and he would begin to advertise and basically usher in entirely new areas of manufacturing, mechanics, law, all of these other things. And he famously said, oh, the Model T only comes in one color, it's black. Or you get your choice of color as long as it's black, one of the two. So what's the result of this? He makes a literal load of money, like $60 million in his time, which is just unbelievable amounts of business profit. Using the 1913 calculator, that is about $2 billion with a B dollars in profit just from selling the Model T. So this all can't be all sunshine, lollipops, roses, and Model Ts tittering across the countryside while the sun smiles happily in the background like a nice Technicolor cartoon. Ford nowadays, meaning this time in about 1913, is beginning to have some problems. There is this movement that's shown up. I don't know if you know anything about it. It's called unions, and they're scary to Henry Ford. Henry Ford sees this union that used to be super powerful, but now only has about 30,000-ish members, called the Wobblies, or otherwise called the IWW. I think it's rebranded now to the International Workers of the World. At this time, you also have the old ones like the Knights of Labor, and other smaller ones, and United Auto Workers, but they come later. I wonder why they formed. It's not like the guy who invented the car would be pursued by United Auto Workers. No. That's later. During this time, Henry Ford is being pursued by the Wobblies. And in case you're wondering a little bit about the Wobblies, the name is based off of how, the Hoovervilles during the Depression, would be like these ramshackle shacks. And they're basically saying people are poor enough that they have to live in these houses that sway with the wind. So, obviously these people in the swaying houses would unite under the Wobblies because all these buildings are super tall and they sway and they're meant to contain hundreds of unpaid workers or little paid workers. So that's where they kind of get the theme from. And Henry Ford is a little stressed about this. So he goes to his business office and he sits down and he thinks. Now, this isn't going to come out of nowhere, this decision that he's going to make, because Henry Ford, during his time making this previously stated load of money, has been an increasing advocate of what people have now called today welfare capitalism. I never thought I'd have to say the word. I don't know about you, but whenever people say, oh, it's capitalism's fault, I'm like, I get like this mental spike in my head. And I'm just like, I gotta turn off the video because it feels like such a boogeyman, but like now I've like mentally poisoned myself so much that I can't even think about it, but whatever. Welfare capitalism. And the idea of that is basically saying, well, I have this massive company, why shouldn't it serve the people? And Henry Ford then goes out to the papers. He sees this high turnover in his factories taking place out of Detroit, Michigan, forgot to say, but all of this is in Detroit. You may wonder why Michigan is a large car manufacturing state. Well, it's because Henry Ford decided to settle there. So Henry Ford goes to the papers and he says, I'm going to pay every worker $5 a day. And everyone goes crazy. Now, you may say $5 a day, that's not a lot. Well, let me put that into perspective. That's about $162-ish a day today. And that's for 8 hours of factory work. You get to sit there and do assembly line work, which Henry Ford also pioneered. And Henry Ford had seen all these people with high turnover rates, hiring 300 people for a 100 people position. And he said, how can I solve this? So that was his solution. And he had people lining up around the corner, all the way down the street, day after day after day, just to apply for these $5 a day jobs. Now, you may ask, why was this so successful? Well, because he had just doubled, effectively, the standard industrial wage. The wage before was $2.34 around, depending on if you were skilled or not, but that was like your average, what you could be expected to pay if you walked into any factory. And Henry Ford just doubled it instantly. This was a grand opportunity, especially if you were an assembly line worker looking to finance a family. This back then was enough to actually pay for a family. I was a little jealous because I was like, I'm making my $5 a day right now and can barely afford to be alive. So this did not come without drawbacks, though. Henry Ford had some high standards because coming off of the fumes of that Wilsonianism and that 18th century Victorian spirit, remember Ford was born in the 1860s, so he would have come up with these ideas of gentlemanly conduct, and the First World War hadn't happened yet, so you hadn't had the chance to get those blown to pieces in mud, blood, and Passchendaele. And he said if you're gonna get paid $5,000 every month-ish, or more succinctly, if you're gonna get paid $5 a day, we're gonna have some high standards. And that's whatever Henry Ford set for you. He really didn't like drinking, gambling, you know, all those things that are associated with the nightlife. He had a squad of like Ford's secret police, but they didn't have any law enforcement authority. They were basically just to snitch on you to get your wages cut if you weren't living up to Ford's moral expectations. And allegedly around 50 to 75% of the company was able to claim this $5 a day with large dividends by upholding these moral standards. I like to think that this rubbed off on the rest of society. Mainly we get our moral compass from the blue-collared Ford industrial worker, but I feel like that's a little too wide-reaching. But you may say, why did Ford do this? This is obviously going to cut into his profit margins. Now, this was the time when people didn't really care about amassing massive amounts of money just to sit on top of like a dragon and do nothing with. This was the time that Henry Ford kind of pioneered, like I said, going back to that welfare capitalism. He's like, I'm set. Like, I'm set, my kids are set, like, I could take, like, half of this and just give it to whoever. So during this time, he also establishes paying large stock dividends to his investors. And stock dividends are for people who hold stocks and they get like sort of profit sharing depending on how the company's doing. It's usually a flat amount or a flat amount that scales with company profits or just a percentage. It goes from company to company. But Ford during this time said, let's just send out a bunch of money to whoever is, you know, investing in me. And he obviously can't discriminate because during this time, he's been switching up his auto part manufacturers and kind of sidelining the Dodge brothers, but they still have about, they still have their 10%. They made a offer to buy out their stock to Ford for about $35 million. Ford said, no. But during this time, after he had this opportunity, about a couple years, he is beginning to suspect that the Dodge brothers are doing something with their money, and he doesn't like that because he's looking at them and saying, these guys manufacture auto parts in a city that manufactures cars. What could they be planning? They're probably planning to build another car company, and depending on if you know your car companies today, you'll know if they succeeded, because yes, it is the same Dodge. So now Henry Ford realizes that with these large stock payouts, that he's financing a new competitor along with trying to sideline his largest minority shareholder, which is a weird thing to say. But once again, going back to the fact that he has this massive, massive fortune that he's looking for literally anything to do with, he's like, it's like that SpongeBob episode where they're like, we've tried shredding it, even burning it. Now we're just giving it away. Like, that's what Henry Ford decides to do. He says, we're gonna build this massive, gigantic factory. It's gonna be the biggest of its kind. It's gonna be massive. It's gonna produce a massive amount of cars per day. And everyone's gonna get paid that $5 a day raise. And everyone's super happy. And it's kind of weird how it comes about because he originally acquired the land in 1915. And he's like, oh, I'm gonna build like a conservatory or something here. And then, you know, World War I happens. And the government says, well, we need you to build warships, Henry Ford. So Henry Ford's like, yeah, I'm in the manufacturing business. I guess I could flex to warships. So he puts a small warship port down in what is going to eventually be called River Rouge. I don't know if you know it, but it's still one of the largest car factories in the entire planet. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Ford sets down his warship manufacturing port and basically does that for the remainder of the war, but then realizes that he's only using a small portion of the land. So why not just, put another factory there, since we're already putting down the massive infrastructure to sustain a warship factory? Why not just put another car factory there? It'll be easy to centralize. It'll be great. So he begins to pump a massive amount of money into this River Rouge project. Now, Ford's looking at his coffers and realizing that he only has about like $30 million to $40 million left. And out of his profits, that's like a ridiculous expenditure, which means he spent about $600 million in our money. $600 million to probably $1 billion. And in around 1919, he's feeling the effects of the $5 a day wage and the River Rouge construction. He goes into the stock meeting, or the equivalent of the board of directors meeting, and says, "Gentlemen, we're going to have to forestall dividend payments for shareholders. Mainly because we're running out of money. Secondarily, because it can't be sustained. And it needs to stop somewhere." Now, there is what is known as a slight massive public freakout. No two people freak out more than John Francis Dodge and Horace Elgin Dodge. They're realizing that they're building their car company and their source of income's about to be cut off just before their rose can bloom. So the Dodge brothers sue Henry Ford. Now, this is Dodge v. Ford Motor Company, the thing that we actually want to talk about in this story. And now that you have the surrounding context for it, it is important that you understand that this is not the first time that Dodge has brought a case against Ford. This has been an ongoing pattern, usually because Dodge is Henry Ford's biggest hater, even though he's one of the founding members of Ford Motor Company. He's basically investing in the Apple of his time. He's basically quintupled whatever money he's put in of that $28,000 to a massive fortune that even if he doesn't form a company is going to basically set him and his kids and his kids' kids and his kids' grandchildren's dogs for the rest of their life by eating only gold. But still, who doesn't want to have more money, right? Now, you may wonder what the Dodge brothers sued about at this time. And the first lawsuit that's going to be important, so you understand more of the context, is they sued that Ford Motor Company was a monopoly. And they beat him in the lower courts, but Ford won in the upper courts. And actually, I'm going to praise Woodrow Wilson. I know I flip him off every time I go over the bridge in DC, but I'm going to give Woodrow Wilson one crumb of credit and say that he actually strengthened antitrust laws, which made the Dodge brothers confident enough to sue, along with, Teddy Roosevelt's trust-busting actions. The Dodge brothers are trying to break up Ford Motor Company by any means necessary, and they're playing hardball. So, they go to court, and I'm not really going to focus on the case. This isn't going to be another 3-hour-long Francis E. Deck nightmare, because I don't have that kind of time to edit this week. Next week is probably going to be a thank you video for everything, as my little Christmas gift, giving back. But anyway, more about that at the end. Dodge v. Ford Motor Company. So there's something about the framing of this case that I think is commonly misunderstood. And for the legal interpretation, I cited a Harvard paper that is written on the effects of Dodge v. Ford Motor Company that was invaluable for helping me interpret the legal and some of the background. This is going to be my major source, not my only source, but it's one that I am taking heavily from in this video, so I really do want to thank Mark J. Rowe and his paper Dodge v. Ford, What Happened and Why, mainly because it's invaluable for the legal interpretation, and I think it dives a little deeper and takes into account the context of the case. Because originally this was just going to be another cold, this happened, and then this happened, and then these people sue these people, and this is how it ended up, and blah, blah, blah. But this kind of inspired me to go more into labor relations at the time, and the context of why it happened. Because the court is thinking that this is a example of corporate charity. Basically, they're saying, oh yeah, Ford made a ton of money and now he's giving it back to the workers because he can sustain this $5 a day wage. And I feel like that's a little bit nearsighted by the court. The music stopped, hold on. Anyway, mainly because they failed to take into account the surrounding context of what Ford was doing at this time. Now, they look at the $5 a day wage and say, oh, this is obviously corporate charity. But the paper that I cited earlier asserts that this is Ford keeping labor in check to sustain his monopoly. Now, what does that mean? This means that Ford, fervently anti-union, by the way, I know I forgot to state that before, but obviously if you're a giant business owner, you're not going to like people organizing and getting their rights in check. So he is fervently against unions. Now, he looks at what unions do, mainly saying, oh, they protect people's employment, they give them more pay, more pay. Wait a second. I can give them more pay. I run the business. So he pumps up the pay so that the workers are less attracted to what a union may offer. Because the struggle when trying to unionize a place is that you have to go against the status quo and convince people that a change would be better than what you're going through now. So Henry Ford is kind of playing into the, if I treat the worker great, they have no reason to seek a union elsewhere. And the paper then asserts it can either be that the money they generate exists because Ford and the workers work together to produce that labor, or the workers produce excess value that it is Ford's responsibility to distribute. Now, Ford's hands are kind of tied in this lawsuit because he has three apparent routes that he can take in his defense. He can take the first option, where he goes spirit of the time, robber baron, captain of industry type deal, where he says, I raise the wages to keep the workers in check so I can keep my monopoly. Now, no one would like to hear that, especially because he's considering a political career in the future. Not something you want to hear as a person, first of all, who buys cars, and second of all, a person who works in a factory. And remember, Michigan being a super heavy auto state, most of the people work in car factories. You know, General Motors is also around during this time. So it's a bad look. The second one is he could say, well, I was simply attempting to keep my monopoly. Now, because of that Dodge v. Ford lawsuit, he doesn't really want to taunt the United States Antitrust Act anymore. So his hands are kind of tied there because he just barely edged and eked out a win. So what's he left with? He has to take, or I guess, chooses to take a public welfare argument. Now, what does that mean? He basically says, well, I was doing this to benefit the workers. I don't know why I'm trying to give him a Donald Trump accent every time. I was doing this to benefit the workers. I don't know what you mean. Monopoly? I'm not a monopoly. I just started this company with a small loan of $1 million. A small loan. $28,000. But he also looks at all the benefits he would get if he takes this, because part of it is, you know, people buy cars, and are you going to want to buy a car from a guy who, in this Victorian spirit of beneficial welfare capitalism, says like, oh yeah, all my workers are just gonna buy my cars anyway because I can pay them off to keep my monopoly? No, it's that modern PR now where you kind of have to say, well, I was doing this for the benefit of my workers, to protect the common American's car sales. And most importantly, Henry Ford during this time knows he's got a legacy to preserve. And that is a major part of why I feel he took this, because he's got so much myth around him. He is like the car guy, the founder of the car. He is like the Wright brothers to the car. And he's already got like a few things that are, you know, really super questionable and gross about him, but I'm not gonna touch it. Put that book away. Don't look at the medal that he got from actual mustache man. Don't look at that. He's got a legacy to preserve. And if he goes down as like, oh yeah, it's a scar that shows his other scars, because, you know, then he's this egotistical robber baron who wants to sustain his company at all costs by, like, Standard Oil having his tentacles wrap around the workers and constrain them to keep the lines running. It's the golden tentacle handcuffs. And he's also got all this nasty stuff around him, and he's just doing this all for profits and to keep his monopoly, and once it breaks, it's going to all fall apart. And he doesn't want that, and I feel that his actions are mainly concerning his legacy, because I'm gonna talk more about it when the case resolves, but he does a lot of things that insinuate that his legacy was really strong at this point. Like, people were already knowing he was going to be a legendary figure after he founded Ford Motor Company and made his previously mentioned a load of money, and it doesn't go well for him. He loses and the victory goes to the Dodge brothers. Because all the Dodge brothers have to do is basically say, he withheld stock dividends from us. We were promised these when we invested. This is a threat to our investment. You know, if you allow Ford to treat us like this, what's it going to look like to the common stockholder when they go to get their dividends from a company they invested in using their knowledge that they were going to perform well? This sets a horrible example. And the court's like, yeah, I guess that's a pretty compelling argument. And gavel strikes, and Ford has to pay about $19 million in dividends. By the way, that's another $600 million in today's money down the drain. And the court just keeps telling him to keep paying those dividends, and he's got to keep paying his workers, and he's got to keep constructing that River Rouge factory, which isn't going to be done until 1928. But how does this end out after he pays out all the dividends? He then says, I'm never letting any of this happen again. I need to be sole steward of Ford Motor Company so I can act in accordance with how I want. So he goes to the Dodges and he buys their shares for $100 million. Now at this point, Dodge Motor Company is already up and running and they're like, sweet, more venture capital for our business. They're fully happy to leave Henry Ford because now he's a competitor and they don't want to be giving him more advice, money, auto parts, all these other things. But he doesn't do this in the way where he walks up to them and he says, hey, can I buy all your stock for 10%? He basically says, well, if you're going to compel me to run my company by a board of directors, I'm just gonna resign. Like, you can do that. I won't be there, though. And he quits. And everyone just says, I'm sorry. They all run to him and they're like, please, Henry Ford, I didn't mean it. It was just a joke. Please come back. Please, I'll sell you my stock, please. And the Dodge brothers are basically like, oh, like if Ford goes under, that may be the entire car industry going under. So they're like, fine, old man, we'll humor you. Give us the $100 million. We'll be fine. By the way, they make an obnoxious profit on this. And now we get to more of the modern context. Mainly because I hear so many people, and I'm guilty of this too, going out and saying, oh, Dodge v Ford is the reason why everything is awful. But I don't think it is that. I think it's just the codification of an unwritten rule. Because it was the unspoken rule back in Ford's time, the all-American time, when everything was amazing and great and the streets were paved with gold and we had industrialists walking around like Ayn Rand style where they could just get anything done and sweep everything out of the way, larger than life. Don't watch the Atlas Shrugged movie, it sucks. I might do a review on that one day. Yeah, you know what? I'll throw it in with the Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged book review at whatever subscriber threshold that I'll never reach. Or reach like 500 million years from now when the universe implodes. I'll throw in a review of the Atlas Shrugged movie. Like, man, you got a budget of $50 million for 3 movies. Yeah, it's bound to go amazingly Ayn Rand's estate and lose all your money. Anyway, it's the codification of an unspoken rule. Because back in the before times, back in the Ayn Rand times, you know, the Gilded Age, I think is what people call it. It was just the unspoken rule. If you invest in a good company, they're going to give you good dividends. You know, company does good, you do good. It was that time before the Great Depression when everyone was like, oh, just put your money into the stock market. It's literally like a winner's game. Like, oh man, you can't lose. And that's what led to, you know, the Great Depression, because everyone found out in an instant that you really could lose, and fast. But it's also a change in attitudes. It's a product of that, in my opinion, that World War I death of the Victorian spirit. Because you begin to see throughout the World War II ages, like with Smedley Butler, go watch that video if you haven't yet. Smedley Butler seeing all these people and businesses accumulating large, massive fortunes, and, you know, Ford did it, and they're not giving it back to anyone. They're using it to instead grow themselves, and that transfers into the 60s and the 70s, and, you know, the war industry never goes away, the car industry never goes away, especially in such a car-based nation as the United States. Probably never gonna go away, especially in Michigan. But this change in attitudes, especially when it goes into tech, it becomes a lot more ethereal, because now you're not supporting a business or an industry. You're now fighting to survive effectively, because business was always sort of cutthroat, but it was the gentlemanly cutthroat. You know, in the Victorian times, it was the, you know, someone conquers a place and they're like, oh, we'll get you next time, old chap. And they walk off and they, you know, hand over the sword and the flag and transfer some little piece of colonial land. You know, back in ye old times, it was like, oh, well, you want to join Standard Oil, or do you want to go under? And they're like, well, I guess I'll join Standard Oil, and you might be able to keep a nice job. But it was the Victorian cutthroat. We didn't have all of these changes that I feel came with the tech sphere, because tech, I feel, changed everything, because it turned products from, you know, a product, right? Ford Motor Company produces cars. Okay, what does Google produce? That's the question that kind of got me, because it got amorphous when Steve Jobs invented the iPhone. He's like, okay, here's the iPhone, and then stock explodes, because what is the iPhone? Well, it's not just a phone, it's like 700 billion other things, and there's an app for everything. And now you have tech companies selling cybersecurity. Like, what's cybersecurity? What does that mean? What does that entail? How do you put a price tag on cybersecurity? And as concepts of what you're selling get more amorphous, so do the concepts of what you can be dethroned by, and how much you can withstand a recession if people find out that, you know, what you're selling isn't really a thing. You remember that great video on Norelco? I'll put a link to it in the description if I can find it, or put it up in the tags if I can do that. But it was an amazing video. It was great because they were selling telecommunications, and when people found out that they were basically supported on sand, the entire thing imploded. And now I feel a lot of people are afraid of it, because nowadays we don't really have recessions, because you'll hear people say, oh, we're in a recession, but that's not really the case, because you look at the stock number as you're, you know, counting your pennies to try and buy like chicken, rice, and broccoli so you can have enough protein to walk tomorrow, and you see the stock line go up, and you're like, well, I guess we're not in a recession, I suppose, if you look at the numbers, even though the inflation is like 300,000% what it was in 1910. You know, getting paid $5 translates to 162 today. How does that work? But it's that amorphous concept, and now people are less generous. I don't know if it's a degradation of moral value. See, this is where it gets into politics, and I think I want to kind of offer a bunch of solutions, but give you no solution. I think it's a decrease in business empathy. Welfare capitalism isn't really a thing anymore, mainly because you need the money for yourself, and the money for yourself is to ensure, first of all, your business, and second of all, that you're okay, and third of all, that you're going to last beyond whatever. And because that money is so amorphous and worth an amorphous amount, it's very hard to determine how much you need or would even want, right? Henry Ford probably didn't need the equivalent of $600 million for his own personal estate, but he had kind of figured that, you know, the way the currency is going, and considering the fact it's backed on gold and silver, it may be safe for me to assume that, you know, 3 generations from now I'll be fine on 600 million, so I can spend that other 1,200 million on, you know, expansion of River Rouge and wages for my workers, because now the dollar is so amorphous and bound to basically the United States' existence rather than anything concrete. Not saying I support the gold standard, but I feel like it would certainly be better than whatever we have now. I have this coworker. Sometimes he's absolutely insufferable because he's like, well, if we bound the United States dollar to silver, silver would be worth $5,000 an ounce and I could retire. Whatever. But it's a change in attitude at the bottom line as to why Dodge v. Ford is important. Mainly because it puts on the book something that was an unspoken rule and now gives people an excuse to do what they were already doing in a legal sense. Because Henry Ford had no obligation to be nice. He had no obligation to raise people's wages. He was doing it for a purely anti-union reason. He was doing it for a purely materialistic and good reason, if you're looking at it through the eyes of Henry Ford. But nowadays, turnover doesn't matter. Wages don't really matter. Real wage growth is stagnated by whatever, however much, whereas everything gets more expensive. I know you've heard this song and dance 500 times, and I'm not going to tire you with the same thing that you've already know in 500,000 other well-produced videos that are far better than mine. But as someone who works a full-time job alongside doing this, it really does show. And I think that's why this is important. I think that's why Dodge v. Ford is important to understand and know the context of. Mainly because it makes me yearn for the time when people would act altruistically for the benefits of their employees. That's what I try to do with my editor, but only he will know in about 6 months, when he probably puts this at the end of a short, whether I have been kind to him or not. So I'm going to endeavor to keep him around. I want to be the Henry Ford of my industry. Everyone's Actually, secondary thought, video's basically over, so if you want to go, that's alright. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Check out my other stuff. If you made it this far, you'll probably like it. If you want another legal case, that Supreme Court video I mentioned about a schizophrenic guy named Francis E. Deck, or that Artaud video. I really do like that Artaud video. Or I have some other miscellaneous philosophizing videos, if you want to check those out. But enough of my advertisement. Where was I? Oh yeah, so as a bonus, for those of you who stuck around, everyone's trying to be the next blank, right? You know, the next Logan Paul, the next, I don't even know who's popular nowadays. You know, some people might say, oh, I'm trying to be the next Wendigoon, but I don't want to be. I want to be me. I'm a pioneer. I want to do what I want to do. I don't strive to be the next anybody. I strive to create out of artistic merit. And just because I'm, in a twisted sense, I'm starting to like it. So I appreciate you sticking around. And just remember, if I make it, you'll see those dividends too. And not just in my content. I'll try and pay it back the best I can. So hold it to me if I ever start to get too dragon-esque. I know I'm inclined to such things. But keep me honest, keep me generous. I want to bring my success to everyone else. So, in conclusion, be a titan of industry, not a robber baron.